Friends, this is the B-side for Ross Gay's Feet that appears in my morning playlist. This B-side will explain why exactly it made it to the playlist. What this video is a recording of is my 3 pairs of shoes. From top to bottom, we have my beaten up work shoes, then my everyday shoes, and finally my house sandals. And I wanted to include these because these are the shoes I've wrecked my feet in at work, on walks, and just around the house. And you'll see why I open with wreckage. So this is one of the works I touched on during my MP1, but something about it just keeps bringing me back, and I knew it was going to be in the MP2. And so, because I touched on it in my MP1, I'll start with some of the expanded thoughts that have come up for me since, before I kind of return to the MP1. Ross calls feet the body's common wreckage, and at first I thought this was about the body again. So my first MP1 was titled Skin in the Game, and I was thinking for this about how Ross gardens, and part of the gardening process is that your feet get wrecked. They get dirty, they get cut, and Ross calls feet a common wreckage. And so I thought at first, because we've all wrecked our feet, as part of life, feet just get wrecked as they take us where we're going. But then I was thinking about how in Inciting Joy, Ross speaks of wreckage again, and when he speaks about skateboarding, he invites us to this new spot, this new stain, this new wreckage. And from experience, skateboarding wrecks the body. And in Inciting Joy, Ross talks about how these wrecked, run-down places become a common place for skateboarders, and mourning too becomes a common place. There's a moment later in Inciting Joy where Ross says it is everyone standing beside a grave. And speaking still of wreckage, in class, it was Jana who talked about the cathartic nature of wrecking things. And there certainly is truth to that. Speaking of wrecking the body, mainly through gardening and through skateboarding, there's a catharsis in it. And we talk a lot about being like, oh, the right kind of sore or the good kind of sore, even though, we've wrecked ourselves. And also, if wreckage here is used to mean mourning, then it takes me back to what we talked about in Dr. Winrock's class about how, we have ideas of having a good cry or listening to sad music just to make ourselves cry and purposefully bring down our mood. There might be something kind of cathartic to that. We've been talking in class a lot lately, too, about capitalism. And so I wanted to return to that for a moment here, because in Feet, Ross mentions the factory where loss makes all beautiful things grow. And I thought, factory is kind of the quintessential capitalist image, and we've tried to make mourning fit into capitalism. So again, in Dr. Winrock's class, we talked about futuromania, which is the construction of a future where our loved one is no longer with us after they die. And in class, we talked about the term memorandum, which when Barthes was writing meant 18 months to mourn the loss of a parent. And I was returned to Inciting Joy when Ross talks about why he doesn't necessarily love skate parks, because it's an attempt to contain joy and fit it within the capitalist structure and say, here is a place where you can be joyful. But we've tried to fit mourning into this capitalist structure. I remember the story Bethany told about how one of her loved ones was only able to get a few days off to mourn and to process. And I was thinking also about, this idea of futuromania and memorandum. We have this desire under capitalism to be productive even when we're mourning. And so much like we have this idea from Ross of a skate park where we try to contain joy, we have this idea of a factory, the factory being capitalism, where we try to contain mourning. And so I'll return now pretty briefly to what I touched on in the MP1, specifically about how Ross ecatones. And Feet starts as a very tender poem about this really beautiful memory of himself and Tina, but then he forces us to confront the futility of mourning. He says, of course she's dead. And in class, we all kind of had a moment of, whoa, that's very blunt. And it reminds us that there's no amount of mourning or waxing and waning poetic that's going to reverse what happened to Tina. And Ross then also says, "So I heard about Tina's cause of death," which also raises questions about closeness and mourning. Do we have to know someone well to mourn them? And then Ross also says he wants to forgive himself for something, although he admits that he's not sure what. And Barth's in Mourning Diary talks about how he doesn't know if he'll be able to forgive himself when the mourning stops, if it ever will. And so I wrote more in the MP1 about how do we mourn because we want forgiveness for something? And then finally, Ross talks about this horseshit trick that poets can do. And Ross talks a lot about the full of shitness of people, to include himself. But again, I wrote in my MP1 that maybe mourning is a horseshit trick, but maybe we don't have any other choice but to mourn. And so even if the trick is horseshit, as Ross says, we have to do it for ourselves and for others.